What is it that we as humans find so alluring about the idea of a post-apocalyptic situation? Especially as teenagers, but really throughout our lives we like to imagine ourselves as individually significant, which is why the chosen one trope, that is, Harry Potter, The Matrix, Star Wars, etc., is so popular across demographics. A post-apocalyptic environment facilitates this sort of chosen one and messiah theme. In a post-apocalyptic scenario, I imagine people would be less messiah and more very naughty boy. It could be the idea of a fresh start, everything we know starting over and giving us a chance to live differently. It could also be that modern life is so safe, in first world countries, that a part of us craves the wild and finds excitement in having to actually put in work to stay alive. Just like roller coasters and scary movies, sometimes life is too cushy that we subconsciously want to feel the danger. A zombie apocalypse is a frontier wilderness war situation where that a regular person would find themselves in, that is, not just soldiers, and where a regular person might have a reasonable chance of survival, especially for traditional slow zombies. It's a survival fantasy that we can insert ourselves into without stretching the imagination too far. I think it's the whole idea of dropping the daily responsibility and commitments you've made to society. No more going to work each day, worrying about money, etc. The thing is, it would be just as much work, if not more, to sustain yourself in that situation. Sure, you don't have to worry about money, but you'd have to worry about sourcing clean water and food. It's probably the idea that our actions will actually matter on a large scale. As it is, your average human is a speck in a crowd, one voice among millions. But post-apocalypse, with the majority of the Earth's population dead or gone, everyone's actions are going to matter. OHH, I like this answer. Most folks are only familiar with post-apocalyptic situations that have been designed for their entertainment. See, we like to compare our daily lives to the fantasies that we see in movies or video games. From that idealized perspective, the prospect of doing away with our jobs and responsibilities seems appealing, but we tend to forget that many of the things we take for granted, access to clean water, toilet paper, the immediate availability of food, and so on, would likely be luxuries in the settings we've seen on our screens. Something as small as a deep scratch would be potentially fatal, too, and we wouldn't have health restoring stim packs or single episode recovery times. There are plenty of places in the world today that are worse than the settings of Fallout or The Walking Dead, and it's rare to hear of anyone looking at them as being appealing vacation spots. Furthermore, everyone likes to think of themselves as being the protagonist, but they'd much more likely be cast in the role of decaying bones in a corner. TLDR, the apocalypse is a nice place to visit when you're sitting in front of a screen. A good movie that was maybe more accurate. The Road. What a movie. It's a form of freedom. Many people probably feel suffocated by the challenges of modern life. We are animals after all, moving from a society where each member was pivotal in the survival of the group, to a colony of bacteria growing on a rock. 7 billion is a very large number. What man once was, now is a corporation, is the government. Like the human body replaces the entirety of its cells in just years, so too do our organizations replace us. Suppose it's nice to fantasize about being back on top, apex predators again. Good bot. I think we are all just really done with society, the daily grind, society's expectations. We all want to go back to being primal. Of the people who want to go back to simple ways of living, I'd bet 99.9% of them would miss the daily grind within a day. I'd think our lives today are stressful and cluttered with meaningless crap. A post-apocalyptic scenario reduces us back to our basic human instincts. Survival, hunting, gathering, etc. Even though it's a stressful situation, it kind of frees us from a lot of responsibilities. No debt, bills, bosses, jobs, or responsibilities makes it awesome. People often don't think of the mass disease, rape, starvation, and murder that would happen. Everyone expects to be the badass in the situation. Humanity is united under a common threat. We're all in this together. People can set aside their disagreements and work together to beat a common enemy. It's likely a non-human enemy, so it's more morally acceptable to hate or harm them. Even the disagreements between groups on how they handle things, people had more understanding of why we have to survive. They were traumatized, it's their way of coping, etc. Everyone is a victim, giving excitement compared to the mundane. Adrenaline is a discipline, kind of like a soft reset on the world. Sure, some groups are better off than others, but they're all knocked off a peg, but the gap between statuses is much smaller. Most actions have instantaneous consequences. You even survive or die now in a couple hours very soon. Whereas the real world, you suffer through freedom of living with society's rules and making your own. Keep in mind that I'm not saying susceptible or above it all. In fact, lot of the above sounds enticing to me, despite dying quickly due to not having my medication being produced. I took the school bus as a kid. I wasn't a particularly picked on or unpopular kid, but still a bit of a loner, especially on the bus. I would daydream that everybody disappeared and I got to drive their cars. I didn't care where people'd go, I just wanted off the bus and to drive their cars. There's something very poetic about this. I can garden, raise and butcher animals, sew, and make things. I'm decent at old Timmy medical treatments and first aid. If it wasn't a total destruction situation, I feel like I'd be reasonably okay, or I'd die immediately. Either is better than being barely employed and terrified of not making enough money for rent. Personally, I find the potential of absolute freedom to be strangely comforting. Yes, every moment will be a struggle for survival, but I won't have to worry about my job, bills, chores, errands, etc. I have the same fantasy, but then I think about the anxiety about jobs and bills and errands gets replaced, in this scenario, with anxiety about getting a cavity without dentists, and scavenging for contact lenses, or being pregnant without modern medicine. Babies can do a lot of damage to a body. I think this is something current society inherited from us Gen Zers. Basically, we grew up in the shadow of the Cold War with all the adults telling us a nuclear apocalypse was imminent, and at the same time all the text zombie stuff, Romero, Russo, The Evil Dead etc. So it was a way of dealing with what we saw as real threats but in a safe fantasy way. But the reason it remained popular and grew bigger and bigger is because the generations that came after us really liked it too. So it's hitting a wide demographic. It mapped really well onto millennial anxieties about the increasingly constraint of Western society under corporate globalization, which I think is what UA Pyrites Appetite describes so well. Fantasies of the rules being thrown out broken through no fault of your own and the survivor hero meeting their needs by living off their wits in some primal way. I think you're onto something. I think it's our primitive survival mode instinct that misses the old times where we had to kill a lion every day and fight to live. Modern days are safer, but also kinda boring somehow, and that's why a lot of people look for sports, hunting and other stuff because of the lack of daily adrenaline. Maybe, deep in the heart, we just want to live something big that would put us on survival mode again. IDK. At the same time, I'm pretty sure that we just wonder about it, but doesn't actually want it because it would suck and we'd probably die first in a horrible way. Let's keep chaos at the movies and video games. I'd really want to see how long I'd last. I'd make it a decent amount of time, I think. Not to the final, repopulate the Earth group, but at least I'd make it to the sanctuary. It's a sort of freedom. The government is fallen in almost every case. At best they are a mere shadow of what they once were and the military has a single remaining base maybe. You can do anything. Steal that. Take that. The world is a shopping mall and the price is free. Additionally, if you're one of the last people alive, guess who actually matters to the human race now? Yep, the author read the main character. It's a self-indulgent wish fulfillment, and I love it. You can do anything. Steal that. Take that. The world is a shopping mall and the price is free, except almost everything is useless now. No electricity yet, and if there are multiple survivors, everyone will fight for the scraps. Just existing on a version of Earth with like 1/100th of the current population appeals to me, even if that means I have to hunt for my own food, give up electricity and running water. 1/100th is more or less the population of Turkey, for example. I was curious. The same thing libertarians do when supporting those ideals. That they won't be the people getting devoured, killed, enslaved. It gives you time to do what you want. I think of that Twilight Zone episode with the guy and his books. All he wants to do is read. I imagine that's the allure for a lot of people. That they can finally do what they want with nobody to stop them. And the idea that of course they'd survive to get to that point because they are lucky, clever, special. I don't. As a woman, I know there would be a lot of rape, a lot of violence, a lot of death. Imagine childbirth in an apocalypse. Imagine getting a dental issue in an apocalypse. Yeah, wet dreams for people who don't really think about it. One aspect of it that I think people overlook is the assumption that there would be a strong sense of community and belonging among the groups of survivors. Most stories in those settings have really intense, committed relationships between the main characters, and I think part of it is the wish fulfillment of automatically being able to build a tight network of friends that genuinely care about you. Largely how they are portrayed in movies and whatnot. Those who wish for apocalyptic events fall into two categories, with some overlap. They rather are so self-centered that they can't see the world continuing on without them, so it must end with them. Or B, do not feel comfortable in the current stage of life and feel an apocalypse would shuffle the world order enough to suit them better than the current world. Am I the only person who would rather be dead for this? The thought of being stuck with one or a handful of people, more than likely not your choosing, for the rest of eternity sounds horrible. If the fate of civilization rests with me, sorry guys, we're going down. I think the complete breakdown of society is appealing. It's the same sort of feeling we get when the boss is out of town, or when all the cops in your city are too busy to patrol the streets because there's a wildfire burning and they're needed elsewhere. There's a sneaky little sense of freedom in these scenarios, so an apocalypse provides the ultimate version of this. With no rules and a new society you can define any way you want, you are finally free to find out who you really are. I think it's just a subconscious yearning to escape our modern consumerist society. No more society, no more bull's job, no more pointless social posturing. I think right now it's the sense of purpose that would come with it. Right now people just work jobs for money, and then use that money to buy all their needs to survive. There's just so much proxy to our basic needs that it feels like everything we do is just somewhat of an act, and that nothing really matters except for what we choose. That's encouraging in some ways, but also a little frustrating to know in the back of our minds. In an apocalypse situation we reconnect with all of that stuff. Our day-to-day actions have purpose and drive because it's the fight for survival, and is about as close as we get to an objective purpose of man. It also connects you to a group. You're no longer a person whose life or death doesn't matter in such a huge population, where having a child is just a burden on our species rather than an improvement. In an apocalypse situation you aren't just one of many consuming faces taking precious resources. You're part of the survivors, the last of mankind. You not only have a purpose for yourself, you have a purpose for your species. People freaking love being a part of a gore-up, especially when it allows them to connect themselves to the achievements of the entirety mankind, which would be an easy connection to make as one of the last people alive. To be clear, I am not one who idolizes the apocalypse. I just recognize the feelings. I think it's the lawlessness and escapism that allures people. Maybe, in real life, you're working a crappy job for a tyrannical boss, trying to pay off your debt. But in a post-apocalyptic scenario, all of society's laws and regulations would be erased. You would be free to wipe the slate and start life anew. You can take revenge on everyone who has ever wronged you without repercussion, and possibly become the wasteland lord that you've always wanted to be. It's a reset. No more societal norms or barriers. That rich butthole you hated 2 weeks ago is now the exact same as you. Yay. I'm in the middle of grad school and actually wrote a lengthy essay on this. Boils down to a carnal instinct for survival, which, in our modern, comfortable, Western society, isn't sufficiently satiated. Consider, for example, the fact that you don't see post-apocalyptic fiction emerging from third world societies, or even in Western society before about the 1970s. War and strife and struggle are still a very real thing in those third world societies, and in the West, was still a very real thing in the early to mid 20th century, though we in the first world have cultivated a, relatively, very peaceful and comfortable existence, that carnal survival instinct is still there. So, to satiate it, we create and imagine the strife. We roleplay, we read stories, we doomsday prep, and in some of the more extreme and worrying cases, we create enemies where there are none. One of the best archetypes of this that I found in doing research for my essay was the behavior of certain protest groups, especially Black Bloc. The demographics of Black Bloc consist of mostly urban youths, hovering around the middle class in terms of income and access to food and housing. For those that don't know them, Black Bloc tends to infiltrate what would be peaceful protests and turn them violent. Analyzing their tactics and behaviors, one finds that, in a way, they're playing soldier. They have a kind of uniform, sometimes even patches on their shoulders and ranks. They even have medics with Red Cross armbands, and will scream for a medic if one of them gets hit with tear gas or OC. The medic will, heroically, pour water on the dude that got hit. It's an example of a group of people that have invented a conflict in order to satiate that survival instinct. One only has to consider the fact that, when going to fight their battles, they're leaving and then returning to a fairly comfortable urban existence. They're not starving, not victims of genocide, and not fighting for survival. On the opposite side of the spectrum, politically, you have the far right-wing preppers who invent the villain of the New World Order and hole up with guns, ammo, and supplies that they'll never use. If their imaginary villain doesn't go to imaginary war with them, that survival instinct goes unsatisfied. Some of them go into a kind of withdrawal and, in a desperate attempt to get a fix, decide to start the war themselves. In conclusion, just play STALKER, TLDR. Modern Western society is, relatively, very comfortable and safe, but we still have to find a way to satisfy our instinctive carnal need to survive against strife. Lacking strife, we use our imaginations, sometimes productively, sometimes destructively. I just hope the nuke lands on top of my apartment building while I am still in there. If it doesn't and I somehow live, well frick. A clean slate, no debt, less people and more opportunity? That's what comes to mind, though the reality is that it would be absolute heck for we who are so used to all our modern conveniences. Seriously, take a moment to imagine a reality when you have no debts, and no responsibilities or obligations beyond the ones you choose. It's seductive as heck, until you realize it's just being a homeless person. But if everyone is homeless? No bloody 9-5. Although I would probably be the first to complain about the good old 9-5 days the first time I got hungry. We envy those who endure and even put them on a pedestal, which is generally considered acceptable, but we ourselves do not wish to endure. I think it comes from the fact that our ancestors were wild brutes and post-apocalyptic situations allow us to once again be the animals we are meant to be. A lot of the post-apocalyptic scenarios come out of modern media, TV, The Walking Dead, The Last Ship, movies, 28 Days Later, Mad Max, and books designed to be made into movies, The Hunger Games. That kind of setting appeals to the makers of these visual media. It's easy and cheap to create. Tear up contemporary clothes for the costumes, smash windows on buildings and cars, make everything look as beat up as possible, buy Fuller's Earth by the sackful and throw it over everything. Wham! You've got a post-apocalyptic setting. By contrast, it takes creativity, effort, and money to show a future where things are good, and you stand the chance of having progress make your setting look anachronistic. I think it's about the world being rebooted where none of the old rules apply anymore. Maybe the new version will develop rules that benefit ordinary people, instead of rich old white guys. I think it comes from the idea of more freedom. It's the idea that you're no longer held down or obligated to anything. Bills? Who gives a frick about bills? It's a post-apocalyptic wasteland. And you know what? I don't give a frick if that used to be someone's house. They're dead now, and I'm gonna live in it. Tomorrow I'm gonna raid a nearby store because everyone's dead. Who's gonna stop me? I think we all just hate a lot of the population, so we like to daydream about only having to deal with a handful of people in the world in which we have free reign. I don't know if people are excited about it as much as we just kind of know in our bones that something like that is bound to happen. It's the sudden lack of responsibilities. I'm picturing some kind of supervirus situation. 99.9% of the world just suddenly dies in like 2 days or so. Electricity fails. No running water. No gas. And yes, as in all apocalypse scenarios, it goes without saying that you assume you're alive for it. It's not likely, but it's a pretty dang boring fantasy otherwise. Sure, getting food and water would be tougher, but it's not like you have your 9-to-5 job anymore. For a good long while, there'd be plenty of canned foods to get you through. Forage while you set yourself up. You don't have to pay rent. You don't need to worry about bills or your bank account balance. If something in your house breaks, just raid some supplies from a hardware store, or heck, just move into your neighbor's house. You don't have to worry about whether you're going to clock in a minute late again. No paperwork, no bills, no credit scores, no worrying whether you can afford to buy yourself a thing, no worrying over haircuts, or deadlines, or keeping up with the Joneses, no traffic, no alarm clock, no overbearing manager or whiny customers, just the basics. As long as I've got food, I'll be okay for a little while longer. I'm a doctor. I own guns. I have survival gear. I'm on all my buddies' zombie post-apocalyptic survival squad. What they don't know and I do know is, I'd be dead in the first wave. My city is almost certainly targeted by a nuclear warhead. Being in a city means some sort of invasion bulls puts the city on its list. An EMP would probably lead to chaos and I have no easy way of escaping my neighbors. There isn't much in the way of high ground, so most catastrophic natural disasters would frick me, but this one is less likely than those poor coastal people who always seem to die immediately in post-apocalyptic environment apocalypses. There's a big biotech university nearby, so I'm sure some Cyberdyne-style organization would make my city one of their bases and turn me into protein solution for their robots or something. Realistically, if aliens can get to our planet, chances are we lost the war before it started. An Independence Day style wiping out of population centers to make it easy to clean up the aftermath seems like a really reasonable alien invasion tactic. But the cherry on this crap pie is everyone's favorite apocalyptic scenario are zombies. I'm a doctor. I'd be in the hospital and someone would wheel in their zombified kid and I'd be the guy that leans over and gets bitten in the neck. I don't kid myself anymore, I'd be dead in the first wave. For me, I have always had this fantasy since I was old enough to know what an apocalyptic scenario would actually entail. I see it as the start of a real-life RPG where you're not really sure what game you're playing now, but the skills you'll have to learn and master are now relevant to your survival and the survival of the human species. The fantasy gives my life more meaning on its own, and taps into my primal hunter-gatherer ancestral DNA. None of this daily grind BS. Pure and simple. I did a lot of thinking about this as a sci-fi fan around when the zombie apocalypse craze hit all those years ago. Sort of felt like I had to, given that I had been talking a big game about liking apocalyptic fiction, but then didn't really seem on board just when it appeared to have hit the big time. This is all guessing, but I think a lot of folks really like the idea of just plain fewer people. It sounds obvious and dumb, but you just matter more when there aren't 7 other billions of you. The amount of modern mainstream fiction that ends with some version of an Adam and Eve striking out to begin the repopulation of the wild earth, despite the genetic problems with this, is my indicator that for most folks, it's not about actually wanting to engage with what a post-apocalyptic society could look like. It's wanting to engage with what no society would look like, or at least one that's mad long on violence and personal freedom and short on authority figures. A whole world to explore, without a stable, established group of people who got there first expecting good behavior everywhere you go. Or, there is, but the group interactions are reduced to caveman level interactions. Combat, barter, avoid. Nothing important in zombie media is boring, complicated or crushingly inevitable, like the stock market. Most important things are handheld and obvious, like a vial of the virus. It's simple. It's nice. My personal answer? I go to apocalyptic stuff for catharsis from my horror at how unjust modernity can be. Every time I see something I consider just flat insane, yachts getting built in cities with starvation, and everyone's treating it like it's normal, I get pretty stressed. My disease is vague, so something as equally vague as civilization has to come crashing down to satisfy it. A particular villain would be no good. A good old-fashioned apocalypse story is a twofer. I get to watch the house of cards I feel constant reservations and resentments about come tumbling down, and I often get to see the author present some interesting alternative. The idea of starting fresh, and all the annoying things in society that make you feel small and incapable of controlling your destiny disappearing. At the same time, there's often this idea of suddenly discovering skills you never knew you had and becoming a success in this new world. Of course, nobody focuses on how horrible a world without AC would be, or working indoor plumbing. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.